Thank you all for joining us for the second session of Airlink's Butterfly Project. Just a couple of housekeeping bits. We will be recording this session. We will release them after the final session on the 7th of July, and we'll send a notification around to all the attendees, so you will be able to see these sessions again. In this particular session, we will be doing some polling, and after the speaker, we'll open the floor up to Q&A. So if you could keep yourselves on mute until that time, that would be great. At this stage, I'm going to hand over to our chair for this session, Robin Mandel.
All right. I'm working from not ideal conditions, but I wanted to join you all because I'm so excited about this project. So thank you all for joining us today for the second session in the webinar series on social programs within ESG. I'm Robin Mandel, and I'm the Secretary of Airlink's Board of Trustees, and I'm a board member and a supporter of Airlink from the time it was founded. I'm glad to see that many of the people from our first session have returned for the second installment, and welcome for those just joining today for the first time. The question has been asked, will you be able to view the recording later on? And the answer is yes. We will make them available at a later date. So this session is going to be a little bit different from the last one because we have one speaker with us, John Mowry, Managing Director of Aviation. We get to introducing him more formally and to hearing him talk. Andrew Williams has prepared a survey to get us all in a participatory mood and to get your feedback and insight on this important topic. Just to highlight why we're highlighting the S in ESG, besides it having important financial backing, we're focused on ESG because the social criteria examine how a business manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates. It includes everything from LGBTQ+, equality, racial diversity from the executive seat down, and inclusion programs and hiring processes. It even looks at how a company advocates for social good in the wider world beyond its limited sphere of business. And so for that reason, we feel like Airlink is the right place to put together this forum to discuss this important topic. As I mentioned, this is the second of 3 webinar series. In our next session, which will be Wednesday, July 7th at noon, we'll have 3 speakers, David Walton from BOC Aviation, David Ashley, Operations Manager for Flexport, and Susie Cabo, Managing Director of Social Impact Optimization from United Airlines. So that will be interesting, and we hope you'll join us for that session. And just to reiterate, at the conclusion of our webinar series, which may go beyond just these first scheduled 3 sessions, the idea is to produce a best management practice guide for the social element of ESG. And so we're going to take the best practices that we discuss here and that we discuss offline from these webinars and put it together in a guidebook that will be available to you all. We'll let you know when we get to that stage. So with that, I will hand it over to Andrew Williams, Airlink's Director of Communications, who will lead us through a short interactive survey. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you, Robin. So I'm going to share the poll now. There we go. So you should now all be able to see the poll and interact with it. If you can let me know if there's any problem. I know we're all intelligent people, so I'm going to let you read the questions. I can monitor you filling them out, and then we'll share the results at the end and go through, see what's interesting and what comes up. Okay, so everybody should be able to see the results. So we'll just have a quick run through. Which aspect of ESG do you feel you're most familiar with? None. Perhaps not surprisingly, as that occupies the largest amount of people's attention at the moment within the sector is the environment, but a substantial proportion are familiar with the social element. How familiar are you personally with the social requirements? I'm familiar with the basic principles is our highest. That's interesting, which shows that this is a worthwhile session and that we can all get something from it. Thinking about your company, ESG is something that has been actively discussed and a framework has been drawn up. It's interesting to see that so by far and away, that's our biggest response, that people are well and truly on top of this and beginning to develop frameworks and have actually been implementing them. 17%, that's more than I thought, not being discussed from an organizational point of view. That's also interesting. Again, proving the point that what we're doing here is going to be helpful. In your view, where is the most pressure coming from? Well, financial markets, perhaps no surprise there. Interesting to see customers and the general public, though. We had in the last session, it was mentioned that our colleagues at Polar who were presenting said that customer pressure was a significant thing, but the general public through social media is clearly a significant motivator, and that's an interesting one. Small percentage for politicians, our competitors appear being left out. I think the general public through social media, that's an interesting perspective. In developing and pursuing the social components of an ESG policy framework, what do you believe will be the greatest challenge? The largest one there is staff resources. Again, something that we did discuss in our last session, and something that Polar indicated that it does take people time and energy to implement the policies, that they were absolutely convinced that it made them a better business as a result of doing it. Framing and reporting results. This was something else that came up in the question and answer session. So perhaps that's no surprise. And that may be something that we need to look at for a future session, is what frameworks look like, what reporting looks like, and how these things are measured. Ultimately, what impact do you think ESG will have on business within the aviation sector? I strongly believe it is something all companies will have to adopt, and long-term will have a significant impact. There we go. So it's the general view is it's here to stay, and this is where we've got to get to grips with it. Long-term, the social and governance components of the ESG framework will diminish in importance, and ultimately only an environmental component. This is a little bit of mischief making just to see whether, at the moment, we know that environmental issues occupy the greatest amount of public time discourse. We know that companies are furiously working to limit their CO2. So we just wanted to see whether we thought the other components would disappear, but apparently not. So this is, again, proof that people think this is something that is going to have a profound effect on the business. And the aviation credit doesn't. Agreed. It doesn't get enough credit. I think we probably all agree with that. And 50% strongly agree that the aviation industry doesn't get enough credit for its commitment to socially worthwhile programs, which I think is also fair, which is why we put in question 10, all problems can be opportunities, and maybe ESG is an opportunity to actually create a meaningful way for the aviation industry to show its credentials as socially conscious enterprises and environmentally conscious enterprises. And maybe that it is actually a big opportunity and not just a new burden. So I want to thank you all for sharing those results. Those will also be made public when we make public the videos. If it's something that you think might be helpful to share with colleagues as you're working your way through your own programs and thinking about how you approach them and trying to get buy-in. So thank you again for participating in that. We will be having a Q&A session at the end, so this is not the only participatory bit, but I'll hand back to Robin and she can introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate you putting that together for us. It's my pleasure to introduce John Mowry, the Managing Director of Alton Aviation. John possesses nearly decades of aviation industry experience. Alton Aviation's New York office, John is accredited as a certified appraiser ISTAT. He has valued the comprehensive aviation assets owned and leased by the world's largest airlines to the smallest end-of-life leasing and aftermarket participants. Before joining Alton, John worked at SH&E and ICF, most recently as Global Managing Director of its aviation consulting practice, which spanned the entire aviation and aerospace value chain. He also led the aviation consulting practice centered on aircraft financing and leasing. He began his career with General Electric, where he was a design engineer with GE Aviation and business development analyst in the engine leasing division of GE Capital Aviation Services. John, thanks for agreeing to speak with us today, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thanks, Robin. I appreciate that introduction and all for joining and participating. Exciting to be a part of the Airlink Butterfly Project initiative, and happy to share a little bit about Alton and our journey, social responsibility. Maybe just on the next slide for whoever's controlling, I thought maybe just helpful to provide a little bit of context and background about who is Alton and where we're coming from. You know, there are a whole host of different types of firms in this aviation industry, and many are supporting Airlink and other charitable causes. But for Alton, we're a management consulting firm dedicated exclusively to the aviation industry. And the team we have kind of brings expertise across all the domains, all the different segments of the value chain, ranging from traditional airline consulting to MRO to manufacturing, good capability across aviation finance. Recently have launched a new initiative in practice in the mobility and technology space, which seems to be quite active at the moment. In addition to advising the sort of operating businesses of the industry, we also advise routinely debt and equity investors that finance the industry and the operating businesses. Just on the next slide, we started the business really with a desire to have scale across the globe. We started with a presence in New York, where I'm based, Hong Kong, and Beijing. But we've had the opportunity to expand and to grow with Tokyo, Singapore, and Dublin as well. Today, we're a team of 30 full-time professionals and have been fortunate to complete hundreds of engagements in nearly 50 different countries. On the next slide, maybe just beyond sort of, who we are and what we do, just peeling the onion in terms of our corporate culture and what we aspire to. Social responsibility is very much a core focus for us. But the culture of the firm and what we set out to establish was a group of professionals that were really centered and focused on clients first. We're a professional services firm and really supporting our clients and doing what we can for their best interest is critical. We think about ourselves as one team on a global basis. So, whilst we have a good presence across many of the major aviation markets, we don't function sort of in silos or in offices. We work collaboratively with our colleagues and assign the best expertise to support an engagement wherever the client might be located. We offer our team members responsibility. So everyone here kind of embraces the client-centric focus and approach, and they appreciate the opportunity to have true responsibility, whether, the most senior level in our organization or coming in as an intern. There's real responsibility to take on meaningful work. Meritocracy is another important attribute here at Alton. Many of the firm's founders started their careers at junior levels in other consulting organizations and have advanced and progressed through working. There are some companies and environments where it's an expectation that you spend a little bit of time and then move on, whereas working to create viable pathways for team members to rise all the way through the organization with us. But finally, and coming back to sort of the Airlink Butterfly project, social responsibility is one of the core tenets here at Alton and what we aspire to. Going back to 2017, when the business was launched, obviously there was a draft business plan was authored, and there was a single bullet in one of the sections that sort of indicated what we aspired to, and it was called just corporate giving. And that was it. We've since expanded on sort of that notion or that idea that we would try to be generous in our corporate giving to include a broader social responsibility framework that includes both financial contributions and also donations of our time. So just on the next slide, once we launched the business in 2017, of course, we had the business plan and quite busy times, but a couple months passed and we said, okay, let's pull out that business plan. Let's make sure we're following through on all of our commitments and aspirations. And so the question was, how do we take this corporate giving bullet and how do we put that into play for Alton and what makes sense for us? We didn't have a framework for how to implement. And so we undertook some research to understand what does corporate giving mean for firms, for consulting, what are best practices. And we came across an organization and a movement that was called Pledge 1%. And as we, peeled the onion on sort of that organization and the movement, it really resonated with us. The movement was started in the sort of the technology community and sort of the startup technologies community that was kind of largely out of Silicon Valley. Some firms, like Salesforce and Rally were some of the original founders and movements. And I'd say, if anything, it really probably came out of the Salesforce organization and their desire and how they thought about giving back to society. And they basically took some of the framework that Salesforce was using and put it into its own separate nonprofit entity and branded it and have used it for good and to encourage others to embrace this sort of a pledge. So what is it? It's they would define it as a global movement to educate and empower every company, every entrepreneur, every employee to be, quote, a force for good. There are currently over 10,000 companies that have joined from 100 countries that have taken the pledge. And in total, they would quantify over $1 billion of philanthropy has been committed through the pledge program. So how does it work? It's basically each company signs a commitment and a pledge to donate a piece of their time from the employees' revenue, profit or equity. And the notional amount is 1%, although it's not a strict, rigorous commitment. And each company is really encouraged to donate what they can or what they feel is appropriate. In some instances, companies that can't make that level of commitment, they'll do 0.5% of one of those. In other instances, certainly there will be companies that donate more than 1%. There aren't restrictions around the program, but it's really just a movement to encourage companies to give back. So as we thought about those four options, revenue, profit, kind of equity, and time, for Alton, there were two that really resonated, and that was revenue and employee time. I think the reason for that was really, as a startup, candidly, we didn't have a lot of revenue once we first started. And so it was relatively easy to make a commitment to donate 1% of revenue. Perception, of course, that the revenue is a more generous donation than profit. So that was good for us. On the equity side, the donations of equity, really came out of that technology and startup environment where there were different series of rounds of funding, and many of the companies or some of the companies would go on to eventual exits and IPOs and the like. And that didn't fit in the cards for Alton. Don't anticipate any substantial equity events, and a little bit more challenging to implement. But the employee time resonated with us. It was easy to make a commitment that we would donate our employee time. And so that's the pledge that we took back in 2017 and have followed through on that each year. Just on the next slide. So then the question is, okay, that's great. Alton has pledged a percentage of revenue. How does that get allocated? And so for that, we leave it to our team of professionals and employees. Going back to 2017, the team at the time undertook some research and sort of explored all of the different organizations that we thought could be worthwhile recipients, and many of them are. We really focused on those that were involved in the aviation industry. And so we looked at Aviation Without Borders, Orbis, Royal Flying Doctor Service, and of course, Airlink. Many of the team here at Alton was very familiar with Airlink and its mission and its organization and its kind of contributions to society in times of humanitarian need. And a large part of that sort of awareness came from our membership as in ISAT and the donations from the ISAT Foundation to Airlink. We did have a desire at the time to, rather than selecting 5 or 10 different organizations and give relatively modest amounts to each of those different companies at the outset, we really focused and we said we'd prefer to try to make a meaningful donation to a single organization rather than spreading extremely thin. And so Airlink was selected as sort of the primary recipient and our only recipient of the financial pledge in the first couple of years. And we've been fortunate as our firm has grown to be able to expand the size of the donation, and last year became sort of a platinum level sponsor to Airlink. As the size of our business has grown and the team has grown, there have been other instances and opportunities and desires from team members to expand the breadth of the charitable organizations that we sponsor. And so we solicited ideas from team members and have selected a number of different organizations that are also beneficiaries of the Pledge 1% from Alton. These include organizations like the Chinese American Planning Council, which is a local New York City-based organization that provides services for the poor, the MS Society, Orbis, a couple different pancreatic cancer charities, and an organization that buys medical debt from individuals who are in default and effectively buys it at cents on the dollar and writes it off. But effectively, all of the kind of contributions, I think, and that's important for us and for our team, all of the allocation of those contributions are determined by the employees on an annual basis. Just on the next slide, beyond sort of the financial contributions, as I shared, we've taken the pledge to donate a percentage of our time. So the way that we think about that is roughly 2,000 hours of work time a year per employee. Multiply that up by 1%, and I think that leaves us with 20 hours per person per year. And so that's what we set as a target for each office. And I think the donation of the time is important and beneficial because it allows the contributions to be a little bit more local in the community. So when we support Airlink, of course, some of that can be a local support, but it can also go, a good chunk of the Airlink mission is to support individuals in more impoverished areas and who are more deserving of help. But of course, in all of our offices, Hong Kong, New York, Japan, and beyond, there's a local need for support as well. And that's where we donate our time. So a couple examples of kind of our team kind of doing a Habitat for Humanity build in Queens, New York, a Food Angel, a soup kitchen in Hong Kong, Earth Day in Tokyo are just a couple of examples. And kind of each team and each office decides how they want to allocate the time and the 20 hours per year. per person. Just on the next slide. So, in terms of, social responsibility, just to sort of summarize, what does it mean for Alton? Why do we do it? How do we do it? Originally, there was this desire to be kind of ethical, decent, and generous from the founding partners at Alton. And that resonates, I think, very well with our team. It's a competitive landscape for talent. We're a professional services firm where our only assets are really our people. And so attracting that talent is critical. We think there are statistics that say 60% of millennials believe that a sense of purpose is a very important reason for selecting employers. And so that's not lost on us. But also, the donation of kind of employee time, it provides great opportunities for bonding and cohesion. And of course, many people who are participating in today's session, no doubt, undertake similarly generous donations of time in their own communities. Kind of reflecting on our experience, we were a clean slate opportunity 5 years ago. And so it was relatively easy to put forward kind of our social responsibility program. We did find the Pledge 1% to be a really useful construct and framework for implementing and operationalizing that desired commitment. I think, communication, kind of an accountability to ourselves and to our team kind of is important. So again, as I shared, a lot of that input comes from the team in terms of where to funnel our donations and our, as well as sort of the time commitments and what organizations we want to volunteer in. And we hold each other available and report out on periodic calls with the team to just keep track of how we're performing with respect to both the financial donations and the time donations by office. So that's our experience and run with social responsibility and what we're doing today. So very pleased to turn it back to Andrew and Robin and others for any questions you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. And I'd also like to thank Alton for being such a staunch supporter of Airlink. We really do appreciate everything you've and your team have done for us. Robin, are you back online? I know you're traveling, so I just want to make sure.
I am.
There we are.
Here.
Great. Wonderful.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I think we should open up for questions, comments, thoughts from the audience. So just feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in.
Hey, John, it's Bob Brown. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
We can, Bob. How are you?
Thanks very much for your talk. It's really inspirational to me, both because of that long time participant and leader of Airlink. To have you guys come through strongly and support us was really encouraging to us. And the 1% is a really neat idea, and I can see you put it into action. Just as far as the other side of sort of my interest in this is that I'm now working on a clean sheet business, and we too are feeling that it's a great opportunity to begin set in motion and in place the ESG format so that it's baked in from day one. So my question is, when you think back to when you started the business, how long did it take you to evolve into what we're looking at here? And did you feel pressure, for example, in the early days to put things in place that would sort of take time to evolve? And just I'm interested in the timeline that you had for getting from where you started to where you are now.
Sure. Thanks, Bob, for the question. I think our experience, as I shared, we'd sort of drafted the business plan and kind of had, a single bullet in there around the corporate giving. And to be fair, it was a couple of months that passed before we sort of brought out the business plan after launching the business, brought out the business plan and said, let's make sure, what are we doing? Are we on track? Are we checking all the boxes and undertaking all the initiatives, that we had intended? And so it wasn't more than a quarter before we said, okay, let's go to work and let's think about how we're going to operationalize that corporate giving. I think we were lucky to find sort of that Pledge 1% framework, because it helped us identify there's a whole kind of framework and support that comes from the Pledge 1% kind of organization that talks about how other companies and what other company experiences have been in putting together some of these social programs and how they donate and give. And I think it as well puts some context around what's a reasonable sort of, amount to donate. I think absent that, maybe we would have said, okay, let's donate $10,000 or $15,000 or whatever the case may be. But I think, without taking the sort of Pledge 1%, the donations may not have naturally scaled in the same way as they have with the growth of our business as well. So I think making that commitment upfront and early was easy to do. So I think we were fortunate to land on donating kind of the 1% during that first year. I think Sandra will probably remember maybe a check that came in on December 29th or 28th of that year, because we did want to make good on that commitment of the first year and continue thereafter. And I think largely sort of the framework has stuck since those early days. I'd say the only shift is kind of as we've grown and taken on more people, there have been sort of these different organizations that, some individuals have felt strongly about sponsoring. And kind of as we've been able to be more generous with our donations, we've been allocated some of the donations to those other organizations as well.
Thanks a lot.
Do we have anybody else with a question? If not, actually, I have a couple of questions, John, if you don't mind. Did you get any pushback from staff? I know you said you've kind of allotted a 20-hour contribution per person per year. I guess over the year that's not a lot. But did you find that there was some pushback from staff saying, "Is this another thing I've got to do?"
I think those are the best 20 hours of our staff's lives. No, look, our team is very motivated, very driven, and work very hard to do good work for our clients. And so I think people actually look forward to and welcome the opportunity to take a step outside from kind of the consulting engagements, the day-to-day sort of work, and spend some time still together and bonding, but of course, giving back to the community. So I'd say no pushback whatsoever.
And if members of staff were already undertaking charitable work, was that allotment of time allowed to be counted as their 20? So they didn't have to give up things they were already engaged in to do company-focused charitable work?
No, a good question. But I guess, from our perspective, that was a question that did come up. From our perspective, that would be more of them donating their time rather than the company donating its time. The idea for us was to really carve out 20 hours of company professional time and to donate that. Now, to be fair, fortunate to be surrounded by a great team, and many of the initiatives that we've undertaken have been done sort of on weekends, things like volunteering for Habitat for Humanity. That's not a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 commitment of the staff. The team has been happy to rise up to do that.
Right. And you are a global business. And I guess as people draft up their ESG frameworks and their social plans, it's unlikely that maybe people will, but it's unlikely you would have a different ESG policy per region of the world. So how did all this translate across your business in the various countries that you operate, which all have different cultural expectations and ways of working?
Sure. I think whilst we are sort of a global business, the scale of our business with 30 professionals, does mean that we can act as a single unit and a single group. I think what's been helpful in our construct is to have, I'd say, Airlink is the primary mission and primary kind of beneficiary of our donations. But then we've also been able to solicit the more local sort of teams in different offices have said, yeah, it'd be great to go sponsor Orbis, or it would be great to sponsor this Chinese planning council here in New York. So that's allowed for us to do something on a local basis as well. And then, of course, all of the employee time commitments are very local.
Right. And one final question, unless anybody else has one. Maybe you could tell us what you've experienced in terms of upsides. I know we saw in the poll that dedicating resources and time and energy to constructing these social programs was an issue. People clearly think it's here to stay. We know it's driven predominantly by a financial consideration, i.e. investor relations. What have you noticed as an upside to doing to the 1% pledge and to having your staff involved in these voluntary programs?
Sure. I don't think we can, from a financial perspective, I don't think we can attribute or quantify any upside or on the top line or bottom line associated. Universally, kind of all 30 of us, the company, feel like it's a good thing to do. It's the right thing to do. There's a very much a firm buy-in from all of the team. And I think people feel good about being able to give back in this way. There is the sort of doing the team act, volunteering the employee time and working together as a team. That's where I'd say probably a substantial part of the benefit comes in, because it lets us all take a break from the professional services side and come together as a team and work together and to do good. And so I'd say that's team cohesion has been probably the biggest upside. Although, from a business perspective, that's hard to quantify.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or points they'd like to add? I don't want to monopolize with my questions.
John, I'm not, maybe you covered this. I apologize if I missed this, but I'm interested in understanding the ownership of Alton and whether or not it's owned by management or you have a third-party investor. Now, I think that ESG stakeholders are often the shareholders of a company. So if you're management owned, that's a special format where you are really answering to yourself in that regard. And if that's the case, then do you have some longer term thought as to whether a strong ESG program would benefit you if at some point in the future your company did attract third-party shareholders, or is that a part of your ESG thinking in any way?
Sure. No, good question, Bob. Yeah. So as you alluded, we are 100% owned by the management team. So no kind of outside capital or ownership in any case. So it'd be sort of the managing directors and directors of the firm who are all owners in the company. And to be candid, this is something many of us have started out with, 15 plus years in consulting with prior firms and had the opportunity to go do different things, but have enjoyed the consulting work so much that we doubled down and tried to do it again. So we really don't think too much about, exiting the business. This is, it's what we enjoy and like to do. So to be candid, thinking about sort of an exit or potential future investors down the road, it hasn't featured prominently in our thinking. It's really been driven around just the desire to give back to the communities that as we should and as is responsible and the right thing to do.
Thanks, John.
Of course.
Okay, well, I think we're approaching the top of the hour. So unless anybody else has any more questions, I want to thank John for his very interesting presentation. And again, thank you for everything you do for Airlink. We're extremely grateful. And I'll let Robin close out the proceedings for this session.
Thanks, Andrew. First, I want to thank you, Andrew, for putting this together and helping us to organize all the logistics, which I know is not an easy task. But we are successfully concluding our second webinar session. Second, John, thank you so much for your presentation and for Alton's support. This has been great. And thank you, everyone, for participating. And if you have any thoughts that you want to share after we close out this session, please feel free to reach out to Andrew or to me or Lars. And if you have an idea for how we can, for a different session, a different topic related to this, let us know. We really want your feedback and we want this to be a collaborative process. So with that, I hope to see you all next week, July 7th at noon, and have a great day.